Dawntrail released, players are suddenly wiping to dungeons. After years of breezing through the game's story, players found themselves facing real failure in normal content. Forums exploded with debates, some celebrating finally having a challenge, while others wondered if Square Enix had lost touch with their casual player base. One savage year later, the community remains divided, each side certain they are right. Why? Because both sides are correct. No, this isn't about perspective or finding a middle ground. It's far more fascinating than that. These seemingly contradictory views are both completely true. And once you understand why, you will see how Final Fantasy's core design created this paradox. Whether hardcore raider or casual, we can agree that Final Fantasy XIV's story is for the most part of trivial difficulty, meant more as a narrative experience than one packed full of challenging gameplay. There are some hurdles, like the Burn, Amaranth, Dead Ends, Golbus. While these play an integral role in the next chapter, for now let's focus on the rest of the MSQ. Imagine a new player starts the game, eager to explore Eorzea. They pick Conjurer, enjoy the early narrative, and once they reach level 30 and acquire Cure 2, they see, wait, isn't Cure 1 much more MP efficient? At 32, they acquire their notorious free Cure trait, reinforcing that belief. From here, they make their way through A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormbard, Shadowbringers, just spamming Cure 1, fishing for Cure 2s, barely ever using their offensive spells when in groups. We all have seen players similar to this. Other players they meet avoid bringing it up, in fear of punishment and conflict, or they believe it's the game's responsibilities to teach these lessons. And honestly, they are right. To illustrate how absurd this is, let's take a glance at someone's journey through Monster Hunter World. When you start out, you're faced with a few small monsters before reaching Astera, the first major hub. You'll face the Great Jagras, an incredibly easy large monster, but a good tutorial nonetheless, having well-telegraphed attacks and otherwise mainly being a punching bag. From here you make your way through the game, and 100 hours later, depending how fast you are and how sidetracked you get, just like in Final Fantasy XIV, you might be facing Elder Dragons or ventured into Iceborne. The player at this point isn't a master at the game yet, but they won't struggle with a monster like Anjanath, which may have given them a hard time when they initially reached it. In contrast, our Final Fantasy player can continue straight to the end of the story, still spamming Cure 1. The game didn't present a challenge to invalidate the beginner strategy. There's almost no gradual skill development throughout hundreds of hours of story. The new Hall of Novice challenges they added are not a big help here either, though I do appreciate the effort. Every now and then, Final Fantasy throws in difficulty spikes, dungeons or trials that catch players off guard. Think of the Burns Mist Dragon. A party of all new players might struggle to complete it. This is a frustrating experience, no doubt, and it can feel overwhelming to deal with a situation like this for a new or casual player. The reason this feels so bad is twofold. One, you have encountered a sudden spike in difficulty which doesn't feel fair or appropriate. And two, you aren't really equipped with the skill set needed to succeed, nor are there any hints that can support you. Even after failing, you will not have a clear lesson to learn from. Further, at this point you sunk probably over 100 hours into the game, yet a mere dungeon gives you this much trouble. Whether you blame the game for being too hard or yourself for not being better, the result is the same: frustration. In comparison, our Monster Hunter player, after a similar time spent in the game, has started facing Diabolos or even Nergigante. No pushovers, but the previous encounters have given them the skills they needed to succeed. Meanwhile, our White Mage has barely learned to not stand in AoE indicators and hopefully what a stack marker is. The game's story heralds them as a big hero, but failing at challenges like this makes them feel like an imposter and leaving them miserable. So would I claim that these difficulty spikes are too large? Yes, actually. Bear with me here, I'll explain, there's more to this. The first thought that comes to many people's mind is, well, just get good. And on the other hand, players are frustrated being told this over and over as if it helps them. It is time we analyze how this disconnect between the two player types comes to be. Someone who takes the game more seriously will get good by looking up information on the game and actively practicing. A more casual player will not do these things, and they shouldn't have to. Take Portal as example. You absolutely do not need to look up anything to learn the game. In fact, looking anything up would lessen the experience. Final Fantasy's story does not teach the player much that they need to know to succeed, and it wastes dozens of hours neither challenging the player nor letting them practice. In game design, a first-order optimal strategy refers to an easy, effective tactic players adopt early on. While useful at first, these strategies don't work later in the game. If not invalidated early, players will cling to them, avoiding the need to develop more effective skills. Players eventually face challenges they are unequipped to handle, and the missed opportunities for growth mean they now must put in significant effort to catch up, often leading to frustration and a higher likelihood of quitting altogether. Free cure fishing is just one example. DPS not using AoE or tanks pulling single packs of enemies fall under this category as well. The game solely relies on us players to teach these things to new players. What conclusion can we draw? Where does this lead? It's time we delve into difficulty and skill curves. In our example of Monster Hunter, there is some spikes and dips in the curve. For example, the first two monsters in Iceborne, Beotodus and Banbaro, are a step down from what you faced in the base game, since there is new mechanics to explore. This makes sense. Similar, there's spikes like Barioth, teaching you to use opportunities like wallbangs to destroy vital parts like its front claws, severely weakening its attack patterns. In Final Fantasy XIV, the difficulty curve is almost flat. Dungeons form small hills of difficulty, with the previously mentioned outliers causing enormous spikes that lead to major frustration. Ironically, these spikes don't even teach players the skills needed for harder content. A well-practiced party can carry an underperforming player through a dungeon, allowing them to bypass the challenge entirely. In summary, the flat difficulty curve means players are rarely challenged. The game wastes dozens of hours not teaching the player a single thing, where other games would have thrown several challenges your way. The player isn't given the tools to deal with these encounters, nor are they given the practice either, or feedback how to improve. Worse, they are conditioned to expect trivial difficulty at every turn, so when something is even minorly challenging, it can feel like a huge hurdle. How could this be addressed to make the game better for players of both camps? Of course, Final Fantasy XIV and Monster Hunter are fundamentally different. Final Fantasy's story isn't meant to be a hardcore challenge. It's designed for casual, narrative-driven fun. The lower level of challenge nor narrative focus mean that the story is exempt from fundamental design principles. Just because it's meant to be casual, even mindless at times, doesn't mean it shouldn't teach and challenge you at least a little. When looking at this graph, mind the x-axis. It's not time but skill. If I were to put Final Fantasy story content on this graph, it would look like this. Because you don't come out of the story anywhere remotely close to a good player. If the story would do a better job teaching players, it would change to this. As you can see, the game hasn't gotten any harder. In fact, it has gotten easier, since now the difficulty spikes can't even reach into the green zone any longer. The story remains perfectly approachable for most players, but frustrations will be lessened and the player coming out of the story will be more capable. Not only is this more engaging and fun for casual as well as more involved players, but it gives all players an easier transition to harder content if they wish to go that route, as they won't be pages upon pages of guides behind on knowledge. To answer the original question, the game is too easy, because it takes dozens of hours to just throw one challenge at the player, leaving them behind on their learning curve. Due to this, they lowball most casual content, leaving those that compensate for the game's faults by looking up guides and practicing bored out of their mind. At the same time, it's too hard for those that do not go out of their way to search for outside information. This is why so many casual players were unhappy with Dawntrail's dungeons. The expectations of trivial content were shattered. The fights were frustrating to them, because they've never had the chance to improve naturally. Finally, we must acknowledge that no game can please everyone. Players come to Final Fantasy XIV with wildly different expectations, preferences, and skill levels. A veteran MMO player might find Final Fantasy XIV's MSQ boring, engaging only during its rare difficulty spikes, but catering to them risks alienating newcomers who wouldn't be able to keep up. And that's just one of the factors: a player's learning curve, what challenge level they prefer, and what they expected from the game all shape their optimal difficulty level. The key is to remain approachable, but not letting players stagnate. By introducing gradual challenges and better teaching tools, the game can lessen the gap between casual and hardcore players, reducing tensions and making the game more fun for everyone. Final Fantasy XIV has been running for 11 years, with 5 expansions. Issues like this can develop over time, slowly and sneakily. Fixing them is difficult. What I suggest might sound simple on paper, but actually implementing it is a different story. Few games have good tutorials, even today. MMOs are particularly notorious on relying on outside information. Reworking sections of the game not only takes time and effort, but detracts from new content, something existing players value far more. NeoGP does not have infinite resources, so despite this criticism, be aware there's another side to it, and just like with the initial discussions, things aren't as simple as they might seem. Thanks for watching, and a quick reminder, there's buttons below the video that do funny things. See you in the next video. Menari out.